On Saturday morning, the weekend before last, journalists chatted among themselves at the park Olympique Lyonnais. They were there for an emergency press conference called at late notice by Lyon owner John Textor, which had already been delayed for an hour. It had been called after the DNCG, the governing body which oversees the accounts of professional football clubs in France, had informed Lyon that they had been handed a provisional relegation to Ligue and a transfer ban owing to dissatisfaction with the club's accounts. Lyon, who were the dominant force in French football during the 2000s, winning 7 successive Ligue titles, as well as recording famous Champions League victories against the likes of Real Madrid, Liverpool and Bayern Munich, now have until the end of this season to satisfactorily improve their finances in order to avoid an enforced relegation. By the time that the press conference finally began, unusually, journalists were informed that they couldn't report on what was happening in real time, and, also relatively unusually, the press conference wouldn't be broadcast live. Addressing that strange decision during his speech, John Textor said that it was because he had a cold, meaning that there would have to be brief pauses in order for him to cough and drink water, as well as citing the fact that Lyon's parent company, the Eagle Football Group, is publicly traded. It was all a little bit odd. But then again, that is an accurate description of the last few years at Olympique Lyonnais. It was barely a year ago that I last made a video about the club's plight. They were languishing inside of the Ligue and relegation zone at this stage last season, having won none of their first 11 games, and I am always extremely reluctant to make updates about clubs that I've already covered, rather than discussing new ones. It is a reflection of the severity of Lyon's situation, and, in truth, the number of requests that I got following the news of their provisional relegation to make a part 2, that they are the third club, following only Bordeaux, who folded this season, and were forced to start out again as an amateur club, and Hull City, the club that I support, to receive follow-up treatment. On the face of it, Lyon have an awful lot going for them. Heaps of recent success, a massive catchment area, a giant state-of-the-art new stadium, and a world-class academy. Also, on the face of it, Lyon are in a much better position now than they were 12 months ago when I last talked about them. OL recovered well from being in the relegation zone last January, finishing 6th last season and qualifying for Europe, and they are currently 6th again in the league, 3 points in 2 places outside of the Champions League positions. With all of those tailwinds, how do Lyon find themselves in such a dire financial predicament and at risk of a first Ligue 1 relegation since the early 1980s? Well, as you've probably figured, that's what today's video is all about. So sit back, relax, and join me, yet again, on a journey to Lyon, lucky us getting to take so many lovely trips together, as we take a second look at the titans of French football during the 2000s, their off-field turmoil, and everything that has happened over the last 12 months. French football is a bit of a mess right now, to put it mildly. Today we are talking about Lyon, for the second time, but in the past it has been Marseille, Sochaux, Saint-Etienne and Bordeaux, twice, and in the future it could just as easily be Auxerre, Angers, Brest, Le Havre, Lens, Montpellier or Nantes, all 7 of whom, according to L'Equipe, are at risk of going bankrupt. In all instances, there are macro and micro factors to take into account. Issues that are impacting everyone, typically with one rather large exception to the rule, and then issues specific to those clubs that have worsened their individual situations. Lyon are no exception. One of the macro factors, incidentally, is the very existence of the club that is best insulated against all of the other macro factors, while exacerbating those problems themselves. I am talking about PSG, of course, who totally distorted the finances of Ligue 1 in 2011 when they were acquired by Qatar Sports Investments. Qatar Sports Investments is a subsidiary of the Qatar Investment Authority, Qatar's state-run sovereign wealth fund, so PSG became majority-owned in 2011 and then wholly owned in 2012 by the state of Qatar. Since then, they have spent over €2.2 billion on new signings. Their net spend of more than €1.4 billion is the second highest of any club in world football during that time. It's Manchester United, in case you're wondering, at €1.5 billion. But hey, At least they have been incredibly successful during that time as a result. PSG's spending has been eye-watering in the context of European super clubs, but in the context of Ligue 1, it is even more preposterous. To put it in some context, PSG are one of only 4 French clubs to even have a negative net spend over the last 13 years, along with Marseille, Nice and Strasbourg. The rest have all brought in more money than they have spent. Marseille, the next highest net spenders, have a net spend of €210 million since 2011, meaning that PSG have a net spend roughly 7 times that of the next highest spending team in their division over the last 13 years. The 3 teams to have won the Ligue 1 title since the Qatari state acquired PSG, other than them, Montpellier, Monaco and Lille all have positive net spends during that time, Montpellier having raised €149 million net, Monaco €112 million, and Lille, top of the tree in terms of player trades, have brought in a whopping €441 million net, which is the 4th most of any club on the planet. Again, it is Benfica, Ajax and Porto ahead of them, just in case you were wondering. In fact, Montpellier, who beat PSG to the Ligue 1 title in the Qataris' first season in Paris, have spent less than half of what PSG paid to sign Neymar alone in 2017 on signings over a period of 13 years. By every single metric in Ligue 1, PSG are in a world of their own. Their revenue, as per the last set of accounts, at €670 million, is 12 times the Ligue 1 average, and it is more than an incredible 14 Ligue 1 teams combined. That is 77% of the division. In the Premier League by comparison, which is hardly some kind of socialist utopia, the highest revenue generating club, Manchester City, only, and I am only using the word only in this very specific context, earn 5 times as much as the lowest revenue generating club, Bournemouth. PSG, meanwhile, rake in over 25 times as much as the lowest revenue generators in Ligue 1. As well as transfers, that also bleeds into the most important metric in football, wage expenditure, where PSG's market distortion is even more absurd. At €729 million, as per the last set of accounts, PSG had the highest wage bill in world football, and the highest of all time, and it wasn't even close. The next highest spenders, Real Madrid, had a €405 million wage bill, 44% less than PSG's. In Ligue 1, meanwhile, Lyon are the next highest spenders, with a wage bill about 1/5 the size of PSG's. When one team is outspending their league's next highest spenders by a ratio of 5-1, not even the divisional average, where the ratio would be more like 18-1, any semblance of sporting competition has been firmly jettisoned, all in the name of a gas-rich microstate in Western Asia laundering their reputation, extending their influence overseas, and diversifying their sovereign wealth fund. So, hey, at least it wasn't all for nothing. Post-2011, therefore, Ligue 1 clubs have faced a dilemma. Either to overextend themselves, with all of the associated risks and pitfalls that entails, in a futile effort to keep up, or just give up. What most have done, hence the problems that we are currently witnessing, is overextend themselves, make a series of ill-judged decisions in a desperate attempt to increase revenue and their spending capabilities as a result, realise that all of that is pointless, the gulf is so big, that competing with PSG on a long-term basis is impossible, and then give up. It is what is often referred to as the worst of all worlds, and in recent years, Lyon have become absolute masters at it. Factor in that Ligue 1 clubs face the highest tax burden out of any of the big 5 league clubs, albeit Spain isn't too far behind. They have the lowest average attendances, again, only just, and, most significantly, 2 false dawns in terms of media rights deals, which clubs had budgeted for, only for them to fall through or fail to be delivered upon, and you have a fairly unfortunate financial devastation-inducing cocktail upon your hands. You are probably already aware of the first of those TV deal sagas, when Ligue 1 agreed a very lucrative deal with the Spanish company MediaPro, which Serie A had already rejected, having had concerns about their business model, only for it to collapse following the first instalments of payments, leaving French clubs in limbo. The deal agreed with MediaPro was the second largest in Europe, behind only the Premier League, and Lyon were actually among the biggest champions of it, desperate to increase revenue. When it all came crashing down, it was reported that every single club in Ligue 1 and Ligue 2 went up for sale overnight, with the exception of, obviously, PSG. The Qataris had bigger fish to fry at the time, like finding ways to avoid paying compensation to the families of dead migrant workers who built their World Cup stadiums. That was dark, wasn't it? Dark, but factually accurate. That is a very terse version of the MediaPro saga, it should be said, only because I have talked about it at length so many times before on this channel, including in my previous Lyon video, but the second TV deal saga, which you may be less familiar with, came in the summer just gone. Basically, after MediaPro folded, Ligue 1 were forced to strike a new deal on short notice for a lot less money. It came courtesy of Amazon, who Ligue 1 hoped that they could form a more lucrative long-term arrangement with, and combined with their existing deal with Canal+, it was worth €605 million a season, compared to the more than €800 million that they were set to receive from MediaPro alone. That was a deal struck on short notice though, as I say, in chaotic circumstances, at a time in which everyone knew that Ligue 1 were desperate. Ahead of the new cycle of rights being negotiated for 2024 to 27, LFP president Vincent Lebrun was bullish, predicting a deal worth €1 billion a season. That was music to the ears of struggling Ligue 1 owners and accountants, who were still firefighting MediaPro's collapse 3 years on. That prediction aged about as well as someone who lives on a diet consisting solely of Monster Munch, Special Brew and crystal meth, as demand was much lower than Lebrun had anticipated and effectively promised. Amazon didn't want to continue their partnership, so that strategic deal was a waste of time. Meanwhile, Canal+, the minor rights holders in both the MediaPro and Amazon deals, who used to be to Ligue 1 what Sky Sports is to the Premier League, were furious at how cheap Amazon's deal was compared to theirs, and still bitter about being snubbed for the disastrous MediaPro deal to begin with, so they didn't express any interest either. The LFP were left with just two competing serious offers, one from the British company DAZN, who have become major players in sports broadcasting in recent years, worth €400 million, and one from Warner Bros. Discovery Max, which would have involved the LFP launching their own in-house streaming service, hosted by Warner Bros. Lebrun championed the Warner Bros. Offer, which he estimated could be worth €600 million, but others were less convinced. After all, the man has hardly got a 100% record when it comes to predictions, has he? One Ligue 1 chairman, who preferred to remain anonymous, described the choices presented to them by the LFP as being, quote, like picking between the plague and cholera, end quote. Scarred by the MediaPro fiasco, and perhaps lacking in trust for Lebrun, the LFP took the safer option of €400 million from DAZN, plus a €100 million minority rights deal with Qatar's beIN Sports, rather than the perceived riskier option of going with Warner Bros. beIN Sports, of course, being part of beIN Media, which is owned by the Qatari state, like PSG, which is all totally normal and healthy, and there is nothing remotely strange about any of that. If you add in international rights, LFP broadcast revenue for the next 3 years will be worth €660 million a season, which is actually less than the previous emergency deal, which was worth €605 million domestically, compared to €500 million now. It is significantly less than the collapsed MediaPro deal, which was worth more than €800 million a season alone, and it is obviously nowhere near the €1 billion that Ligue 1 clubs have been led to expect by Vincent Lebrun. To compound that funding shortfall, following the collapse of MediaPro, Ligue 1 sold 13% of their future media rights to CVC Capital for €1.5 billion in a desperate attempt to raise funds. That was a vital fundraising effort at the time, but what it means now, of course, is a smaller slice of an even smaller pie for Ligue 1 clubs moving forward. According to some sources, the Ligue 1 title winners this season will make about as much in Ligue 1 broadcast revenue as Clermont Foot, who finished bottom of the league, did last season. Clubs responded by informing the LFP that, having budgeted for a €1 billion TV deal, and only ending up with a €500 million one, many of them were on the verge of bankruptcy. Nonetheless, Vincent Lebrun was recently re-elected as president of the LFP with more than 80% of the votes. Ligue 1 gets lumped in together with the Premier League, Bundesliga, La Liga and Serie A as a so-called Big Five league, and as per UEFA coefficient rankings, it is the 5th strongest league in Europe. But only just. The reality is that Ligue 1 clubs are trying to raise revenue and spend like Big Five league clubs when, in actual fact, by many metrics, including some of their economic fundamentals, they are much closer to the Portuguese Primeira Liga or the Dutch Eredivisie than they are to the Premier League or the Bundesliga. And last but not least, there was COVID, which took a sledgehammer to the accounts of practically every club in world football, but, in a European context, particularly harshly hit clubs in France. That's because it came at the same time as the MediaPro deal collapsed, so clubs were already staring down a financial abyss, making a secondary shock ruinous, but it's also because Ligue 1, unlike Europe's other so-called Big Five leagues, wasn't just put on hold during the 2019-20 season, restarting behind closed doors, it was halted and never returned. That meant that clubs not only missed out on matchday revenue for a couple of years, like everyone else, they also missed out on an additional 10 or 11 games of broadcast revenue as well. So those are the macro problems, impacting all French clubs, but there are lots of ways in which Lyon are uniquely affected and have created a rod for their own back. In terms of the terminated 2019-20 season, for example, Lyon didn't just miss out on the short-term revenue of no crowds and playing 10 matches fewer. The fact that the league table was determined on a points-per-game basis saw them finish 7th, missing out on European football for the first time in 24 years. Lyon felt confident that, having improved following Rudy Garcia's appointment, if the season had been allowed to restart, they would have qualified for the Europa League. Of course, being in no UEFA competitions means no UEFA revenue. Following a quarter of a century as a permanent fixture in Europe, and typically in the much more lucrative UEFA Champions League, Lyon missed out entirely for a second and then a third time in the 2022-23 and 2023-24 seasons, an unwelcome habit which carries significant consequences when it comes to the club's bottom line. I don't want to go over the entire modern history of Lyon, I covered that extensively in the previous video, so if you want more background and to keep listening to my voice, and quite frankly, why wouldn't you, feel free to give it a watch now or at the end of this video. For those of you who don't fancy doing that or didn't at the time, I won't hold it against you, and I will give you a very condensed version so that you're not entirely out of the loop. Basically, back in the 1980s, Jean-Michel Aulas bought Lyon and became their president, at a time in which the club was struggling to get out of France's second division, now known as Ligue 2. Sleeping giants at the time, despite Lyon being France's third largest city and second largest metropolitan area, and Olympique Lyonnais, the city's only major club, before Aulas, they had never won a top-flight league title, they hadn't won the Coupe de France since 1973, and they hadn't competed in Europe for more than a decade. Aulas transformed Lyon as a club and as an institution from top to bottom, founding the first modern football development academy in France, clearing the club's debts, and implementing among the most innovative and well-organised coaching, sports science, scouting, recruitment, and youth development programs in Europe. The results were emphatic. Lyon won promotion to Ligue 1 in the 1988-89 season. They qualified for the UEFA Cup in the 1991-92 season, fulfilling Aulas' promise to take Lyon from Division 2 to European qualification in only 4 years. And in the 2000s, they were utterly dominant, becoming the first and, despite PSG's ludicrous spending, still the only team to win 7 straight Ligue 1 titles. Following the last of those 7 league titles, and Lyon's first and only treble, Lyon boss Alain Perrin stepped down after a single season, owing to disagreements with the club's backroom staff. While everything appeared to be going swimmingly from the outside looking in, internally, Aulas had become utterly obsessed with Europe, where Lyon lost narrowly against eventual finalist Manchester United in that season's round of 16. In many ways, this was the beginning of the end for Lyon as the dominant force in French football and a major force in Europe. As I put it in my previous Lyon video, Aulas' same intensity and feverish ambition that took Lyon from obscurity to greatness would ultimately bring them down. Over the next few years, Lyon lost key players like Hatem Ben Arfa, Karim Benzema, and club legend Juninho Pernambucano, and unlike in previous years, they weren't able to replace them. They relinquished their stronghold on the Ligue title as a result, and before you knew it, along came PSG, making it practically impossible for them to ever regain it. Whilst those around them innovated, copying and then building upon the blueprint that Aulas had laid out at Lyon, Lyon stood still and would gradually be left behind. In the 2005-06 season, Lyon were the 11th richest football club in the world, according to the Deloitte Football Money League, with revenue totalling almost €128 million. Aulas, meanwhile, was the last president of G14, an organisation created in the late 90s to represent the interests of Europe's biggest clubs and a precursor to the European Club Association. Lyon and Marseille were France's only G14 representatives. 18 years on, Lyon's revenue has fallen in real terms when measured against ordinary inflation, let alone football-specific inflation. They are nowhere to be seen in the Deloitte Football Money League, let alone challenging Europe's elite. And when the European Super League abomination reared its ugly head, Lyon would be left waiting for an invitation, despite their new owner, John Textor, who acquired 77.49% of the club in 2022, being an advocate for the globalisation of football and more integrated international competitions. It would be easy to portray Lyon's downfall as entirely John Textor's fault, as many people have. But in reality, Lyon had already gone 14 years without winning a Ligue title before he arrived, and while Textor's takeover brought with it a unique set of challenges and problems, which we are about to come on to, the rot set in under Aulas. The appointment of club legend Juninho as a director of football in 2019, who had no prior experience in football administration, reflected the extent to which Aulas appeared to have taken his eye off the ball. Juninho's first big call was to hire his own former teammate Silvinho as head coach, who also had no prior experience in management, in a cocktail of nepotism, incompetence, and inexperience that saw Lyon make their worst start to a season in decades. Silvinho was sacked after just 9 games, having only won 1 of them, in a run of form which ultimately cost Lyon a place in Europe in that Covid-impacted season. Without that misstep, their situation now might be very different. Nonetheless, as part of John Textor's deal to acquire Lyon, buying out 40% of the OL group and a majority of Aulas' shares, Jean-Michel Aulas was to stay on as president. In theory, it made total sense. Aulas knew Lyon better than anyone else, even if his methods and judgment had become a little bit more suspect in recent years, and he could at the very least provide a smooth transition as the new ownership, who could inject far greater resources than him, familiarise themselves with Lyon and French football as a whole. In reality, it was an arrangement that was doomed to fail. For 35 years, Jean-Michel Aulas was Lyon. He was the owner, president, and, to all intents and purposes, the CEO, calling all of the shots with unrestrained control. Answering to anyone other than himself appeared to be a shock to the system, and pretty quickly, Aulas was described as having seller's remorse, with significant disagreements with the new ownership regime emerging. Textor, meanwhile, unlike a lot of American asset management investors in European football clubs, is very hands-on. Textor also likes control, which is one of the reasons why he has been open to offers for his 40 to 45% stake in Crystal Palace for more than 12 months. Textor, through Eagle Football Holdings, is the largest single shareholder at Crystal Palace, but since David Blitzer, Josh Harris, and Steve Parish act as a single voting bloc with a combined 46.74% of the club's shares, they, and by they, what I really mean is Steve Parish, is able to call the shots. Textor has a grand vision of how a multi-club ownership model should work, totally integrated up to and including a club's finances, with cash flows from one club being able to support another club within the group in their hour of need, and vice versa. At Palace, because Textor isn't in total control, he can't implement that degree of integration, which is why, despite it having been an excellent investment in terms of the increase in the value of his assets, overseen by Parish, Textor has put his Palace shares up for sale and expressed an interest in acquiring controlling stakes in Watford, Queen's Park Rangers, Newcastle United, and, most recently, and most notably, Everton, where he missed out to fellow American investor Dan Friedkin of the Friedkin Group, who is also the owner and president of Roma. In case you hadn't noticed, multi-club ownership models are all the rage these days. Soon, every club and everything in the world will just be owned by one big mega corporation, which might sound dystopian, but boy oh boy will their scouting, data analysis and accounts be integrated. Textor's master plan, it seems, was to buy up an impressive portfolio of geographically diverse football clubs within a multi-club ownership structure, increase their revenue as much as possible, hype the hell out of the holding company, namely Eagle Football Holdings, and then relist it on an American stock exchange and make bank. Right now, Eagle Football Group, Lyon's parent company in France, formerly known as OL Group, is listed on the Euronext Paris. Eagle Football Group is a subsidiary of Eagle Football Holdings, though, a company which is currently registered in the United Kingdom, but Textor plans to relocate to the United States with a successful IPO on a stock exchange in America. If you're wondering about the name, the Eagle in Eagle Football Group and Eagle Football Holdings has less to do with the bald eagle found in a lot of American symbolism, and more to do with Textor's initial plans to buy a controlling stake in Crystal Palace and Benfica, two clubs who are nicknamed the Eagles. Given that Textor failed to acquire a majority stake in either Palace or Benfica, and is now looking to sell his minority stake in the former, it doesn't really make any sense, but believe me, that is the least of anyone's worries right now. As well as being atypical in terms of his day-to-day involvement among American asset management investors, Textor is also unusual in his transparency and genuine interest in football. Textor's earliest involvement in football administration and ownership came in his home state of Florida, where he founded an academy to provide a pathway to professional football as an alternative to the pay-to-play model that makes youth team football prohibitively expensive for a lot of Americans. Textor's continued interest in youth development helps to explain a lot of his subsequent acquisitions. Lyon are so synonymous with their academy that their nickname is Les Gons, or the kids in English. Crystal Palace's academy has punched above its weight for decades. Belgian outfit Molenbeek have consistently promoted from within since Textor arrived, and Botafogo are the club that launched the professional careers of legends like Garrincha, Jairzinho, and Nilton Santos. Likewise, when Laurent Blanc was sacked just 3 games into this season, he was replaced by Pierre Sage, a 45-year-old youth coach who joined the club in 2019, never played professional football, and is relatively unknown. Of course, there is also a more cynical way of looking at Textor's interest in youth development. Developing players and selling them on for a profit is a useful way of increasing revenue, something which Eagle Football Holdings has a laser-like obsession with, sharing the percentage revenue increase of the clubs that they own on the landing page of their website, and appointing a youth team coach is obviously much cheaper than appointing a more seasoned, experienced, and in-demand manager with greater pedigree. Similarly, one could argue that Textor may be transparent and communicate more than a lot of other owners, but since Eagle Football Group is publicly traded, and he hopes to take Eagle Football Holdings public soon, there is a degree of transparency which he is mandated to provide. Eagle Football Holdings owned clubs, it is just worth noting, have a very mixed record. Lyon are in turmoil, Molenbeek were promoted but subsequently relegated last season, Palace have done an excellent job of establishing themselves in the Premier League, although they are currently in the relegation zone, and Textor is a lot less involved in their fate. Meanwhile, Botafogo, aptly nicknamed Bottlefogo, spectacularly combusted, having been miles clear at the top of the Campeonato Brasileiro midway through last season, and are currently joint top of the league once again, tied with Palmeiras. What is almost uniquely impressive is that supporters of almost all of Textor's clubs seem to feel as though they are being exploited to benefit someone else. Lyon fans look at Botafogo flourishing while they flounder and feel that way. Botafogo fans look at record signings like Thiago Almada and Luis Enrique and expect them to be sold onto Lyon before long, as though they are a feeder club, as well as listening to Textor literally state that he could use their funds to solve Lyon's current cash flow and debt problems. And Molenbeek fans feel like a minor cog to be used as a route into Europe for players for visa and development purposes. Palace fans, meanwhile, feel like Textor just doesn't really want to be there anymore, and, in all fairness, he doesn't really deny that accusation. As well as pointing to Botafogo funds being able to help Lyon in that recent press conference, Textor also cited the potential sale of his stake in Palace as a significant cash injection for Eagle Football Holdings, which he claims would more than cover the funds that the group needs to raise. Textor has now solicited the help of the Rain Group to try and find a buyer for his Palace shares. Textor was both bullish and incredibly boring in his 2-hour press conference. Honestly, a great cure for insomniacs, I would recommend, but just be careful you don't slip into a coma. Claiming that there was, and I quote, no chance that Lyon will be relegated, that most of the concerns around the club and EFH's finances were misunderstandings, and that recent revenue figures were actually very positive. In a previous press conference, Textor also stated that failure to qualify for the Champions League, let alone just avoiding a provisional relegation, would constitute a failure for Lyon this season, and in some ways, he's right. Lyon's wage bill was the second highest in Ligue 1 in the last set of fully published accounts throughout the league, trailing only PSG. And while it has fallen, reportedly, from 157 to 128 million euros since the 2021-22 season, Textor is reportedly targeting further cuts, reducing the club's wage bill to just 74 million euros next season. That would constitute a slashing of more than 50% in just 4 years, and of course, even more in real terms, from a season in which Lyon only finished 8th. Textor also claims, however, that Lyon have no need to sell, and that if they do sell their best players, they will be suitably replaced. Both of these things can't be true. Textor has cited Lyon's bloated squad size, saying that cutting it from 29 to just 23 or 24 players could cut significant costs, but to get anywhere near that 74 million euros figure, Lyon's best players would have to depart and either be replaced by much cheaper ones or not at all. In the 2021-22 season alone, Lyon's debt rose by 75 million euros, from 383 to 458 million euros, up from 227 million euros in 2020. Effectively, Lyon suffered a three-pronged attack in the form of Ligue 1's double whammy media rights fiascos and revenue shortfalls, the COVID-19 pandemic, and failure to qualify for Europe, culminating in a situation whereby the notoriously strict DNCG are no longer satisfied by their forward accounting. Factor in a very expensive stadium move, the Parc Olympique Lyonnais cost 480 million euros to build in 2016, which Lyon is still paying for, to the tune of a 50 million euro repayment in the 2021-22 season, reducing the total amount that they owe for the stadium from 161 to 114 million euros, and Lyon are by far the most indebted club, even in a league which is beset by financial crises. As per their last set of accounts, Lyon were in 458 million euros of debt, 2.5 times as much as the next most indebted club in Ligue 1, Monaco. There is a misconception that Lyon, therefore, have to raise €500 million before the end of the season, which would be functionally impossible, in order to avoid their provisional relegation being upheld. In actual fact, almost all clubs have some debt, and Lyon would likely only have to clear around 100 million euros of their debt by the end of the campaign in order to satisfy the DNCG, along with making cuts in other areas, and some other guarantees. I say only in relation to the off-quoted figure of €500 million, but 100 million euros is still obviously quite a lot, and it is why Lyon fans fear that their most valuable assets, like Malik Fofana and Ryan Cherki, could depart in January, with Lyon unable to replace them. What's more, Textor has already sold off several of the club's assets. OL Feminine, Lyon's extremely successful and fairly lucrative women's team, is now 52% owned by Michel Kang, who also sits on the OL Group board. OL Reign, since renamed Seattle Reign, the OL Group's women's franchise in America, was sold to the Carlyle Group in 2023, and in a bizarre set of circumstances, the OL Group agreed a deal in the summer to sell the LDLC Arena to Holnest for €160 million. Lyon built the LDLC Arena next door to their stadium and training centre at a cost of €141 million as a means of creating an additional revenue stream. Construction started in January 2022 and was completed in November 2023. I describe it as a bizarre set of circumstances because Holnest, the group that has now agreed to buy the arena, is the holding company that manages Jean-Michel Aulas and his family's investments, which still owns, an 8% stake in Lyon. Aulas was pushed out as president just 4 months after Textor bought Lyon, and he subsequently started legal proceedings against the club relating to his departure, leading to Lyon's accounts containing €14.5 million being frozen in August 2023. In an official club statement, Lyon described Aulas's legal action as an attack that was, quote, as violent as it is illegitimate, end quote. It was around this time that the DNCG first sanctioned Lyon, and the club sold Ghanaian youngster Ernest Nauma to Eagle Football Holdings owned Molenbeek for a Belgian record €25 million, only to send him back on loan to Lyon, and then sell him back to Lyon 12 months later for €28.5 million in order to avoid being hit with spending restrictions by the DNCG. Aulas going from threatening legal action against Lyon to acquiring, or at least agreeing to acquire their arena for €160 million, I'm sure you'll agree, is a fairly unusual set of circumstances. This is how I ended my last video about Lyon. Over to you, younger and more handsome Alfie from 2023. As things stand, Lyon are a mess. They still ought to have too much quality to go down this season, particularly in attacking areas, despite their dreadful start. But a broader malaise means their long-term fate is just as pressing of a concern. Lyon have gone stale in terms of their tactics, coaching, and recruitment. Combine that with a first ownership change in over 35 years, an ongoing melodrama between the old and new owners, and continuing to sell their best players with little strategy anymore as to how to replace them, and Lyon's broader demise, whilst more sudden at the start of this season than anyone could have foreseen, ought not come as any great surprise. Not only younger and more handsome then, but also frighteningly prescient. What a catch. Not like 2024 Alfie, who is an elderly and hideously ugly freak and totally clueless about everything. At the time, Textor said that it was much too soon to judge his time at Lyon. Give me a year and a half, he said. Our approach has worked in other markets. We'll see if it works in Lyon. End quote. That was 13 months ago. Since then, Lyon have been hit with a transfer embargo and a provisional relegation. Textor now has 5 months, not only to redeem his reputation within the time frame that he said he should be judged, but to keep Lyon in Ligue 1. Eagle Football Holdings paid €900 million for Lyon, which is by far the highest price tag that a French football club has ever been sold for. Most of that funding, a reported $500 million, was borrowed from Aris Management, a Los Angeles-based global alternative investment management firm operating in the credit, private equity, and real estate markets. Last month, it was reported that Eagle Football Holdings were looking to borrow a further $300 million, in large part to repay part of their loan to Aris Management. This is what is known within the world of business as refinancing or debt restructuring, and is referred to in the world of football as a mess. It is a technical term, admittedly, don't worry if you're not familiar with it, but it describes Lyon's current predicament pretty well. Football governance is in crisis throughout much of the world right now, but the current situation in France, powerhouses of the global game, back-to-back World Cup finalists, and arguably the greatest talent factory for football in all of the world right now, is especially precarious. The fact that Lyon, 7-time Ligue 1 champions in the living memory of someone my age, under 30, just, being handed a provisional relegation with €500 million of debt, and an ownership regime that stumbles from one crisis to the next, isn't the biggest story, at least in European football, for days, weeks, if not months, speaks volumes in of itself. This sort of thing has become normalised, but there is nothing normal about it. Football is cyclical. Clubs like Lyon should have golden eras and dark days. That is perfectly normal and healthy. But in those dark days, the question marks ought to surround the talent of their players and management, not their fundamental future viability. That is it for today's video, but thank you all very much as ever for watching. Hit the like button if you enjoyed it. Sorry it was so long, but believe me, there was actually quite a lot to leave out, and if you want more context, as I say, check out my previously on video, still fairly recent and absolutely relevant. As I say, hit the like button if you enjoyed it, let me know your thoughts down below in the comments, and of course, it goes without saying, make sure that you are subscribed and have notifications turned on not just for this channel, HITC Sevens, but also my second channel, Alfie Potts Armour, both of which should be about to appear on your screens now, along with that first Lyon video that I just mentioned, and a video from my Alfie Potts Armour channel. You can also find me on Twitter, Instagram, Threads, and Blue Sky. Is that what it's called? Yeah, I think so. At HITC Sevens is the username on the first three. I think Alfie Potts Armour on the last one. And all of those links, plus a whole lot more, should be down in the video description below. Cheers.